basically.
Looking at Uganda as an example. Hello. Do we need to turn it down? This one. Yes. Hello. A little bit better. I think there's an in-house system that we're hearing from. We might need to turn that down. as effective as this. And often I think the success rates with a seasoned practitioner and food security experts such as Josephine and St Jude, success rate is maybe 80% plus. There's always issues here and there, whether maybe I don't know that you see 100%, but a huge majority with the right support and the right interventions, often lead to that. And then, just looking at making sure that, for example, that these structures or the access is still able to continue into the years beyond the project. Yeah. So yes, very, very high success rate.
Thank you so much. So we've heard about food security and healthy food systems from the very small scale. And now we're actually moving to the very other end of the spectrum with our second speaker tonight, Professor Anne-Marie Thao, who studies food systems and nutrition policy with a focus on how effective engagement between policy sectors can be achieved. She also regularly consults with national governments and international agencies regarding food security policy, including current appointments to World Health Organization's Nutrition Guidance Advisory Group, the United Nations Tax Committee, World Bank Macroeconomic Division, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Before undertaking her PhD at the University of Sydney, Anne-Marie worked with the governments of Australia and Fiji on nutrition policy issues, and she trained in nutrition and has a master's in public policy and economics. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for the invitation. And as I begin, I wanted to add to Michelle and Eileen's acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people, and particularly to highlight a really rich tradition and wisdom that the Indigenous people in Australia embody, and the opportunity that we have to learn from that really big wisdom, and to also pay my respects to others past, present, and emerging. Thank you so much, Eileen, for the comprehensive overview of all of the multiple challenges and your introduction. And I think what was exciting was to hear about not only the challenges, but also the glimmers of hope, where we do see potential for change, and particularly grassroots and community level change, where, you know, we can actually see that things could change, that different food systems might be possible. But we can't get away from the fact that the status quo is not delivering that, and particularly that those global economic forces that, as you said, even undermining local attempts to introduce agroecological approaches holistically, are really mean that we're in this situation where we're facing a complex, globalized food system from which numerous large, powerful corporations currently benefit, and in which it can feel quite difficult for us to see how change can happen. And so what I wanted to speak to today was really how, I think quite complementary to what Eileen was speaking to, in terms of what it looks like for us as women working in the agricultural development space, to think about how we contribute to change and how we think about our practice. And I'm part of a leadership collective, which is for the Next Generation Leadership Collective. It's focused on nourishing food systems. And one of the things that we were struck with when we set this up during COVID, so it was 2020, was that a lot of the leadership practices that we see in food systems tend to follow kind of what might be traditionally construed as like very masculine and top-down approaches to leadership, and that in contrast, while not wanting to buy into gender stereotypes completely, but many of the leadership practices that traditionally are associated with a more feminine style and have in the past been looked down on sometimes, actually offer us hope for change, because what we saw is that the way that leadership is being done in food systems, and you highlighted that even at the community level, women are often marginalised in food systems, despite being the people who are producing the majority of the world's food. We'd like to see change, and thinking about leadership differently is part of that. So what I wanted to do is, I guess, as per your brief, Michelle, to sort of reflect on career and practice as a woman working, I guess, in a development adjacent space in the food system. It's to reflect on three values that I think are pretty common among women working in this space, and to reflect on where I see us practicing, and with the aim of encouraging us to deepen and lean into some of those things that perhaps are not traditionally associated with career progression and hard-nosed ambition, but I think actually nevertheless really deeply reflect what ambition looks like done well, and also the opportunity that we have to model and to really celebrate leadership that is inclusive and challenges the status quo. So the three values that I wanted to reflect on are making a contribution, building community, and justice. I'm definitely going to do a shout out to Brené Brown. I read her book Dare to Lead about 5 years ago and would highly recommend it. She said during your life to choose two values, so bucking the status quo by having three. So to start with, in terms of making a contribution, this I think is really common to pretty much everyone who works in development. And when I started my career as an ambitious woman, my dad said to me, I appreciate that you want to make a difference, but what I would encourage you to do is to think and talk about making a contribution, rather than to focus on the difference, because what you can control is that contribution you make, and having clarity on your contribution will keep you going when it feels like you can't see any difference. And that was really impactful for me. For the record, my dad denies any knowledge of saying that, but it was really impactful. And I think for me, coming into food systems and nutrition through a policy lens was really the result of working in a nutrition department in a hospital in Canberra and seeing people come in after they've had their heart attacks. They're at the peak willingness to change their diets, and the dietitians would tell them, yes, okay, fantastic, this is what you need to do, you need to eat healthy, you need to do this. And I saw them going out into this incredibly unhealthy food environment, and all I could think was, this seems really unfair. These people are desperate to change. They already have had a heart attack, and it's like the hardest possible option to choose a healthy food. And what we see globally is this writ large, that food environments are such that the healthy food is not the cheapest, the most accessible, the heavily marketed option. It's entirely the reverse. And so I see policy as a way to start to think about, well, how do we change those environments in which people are making decisions about what they eat? And I think as I've progressed in my career and thought about, okay, well, how do we then address how expensive is food? Is it marketed appropriately to how healthy it is? Absolutely not. Do people have access to food that would nourish them? It's made me realize how when we think about I guess changing those environments, we need to engage a lot with really those economic drivers, and in fact sometimes also those macro policy agendas. And this is by no means to say this is the one way to make a contribution, but for me I think that's been a really important part of the journey in time, and trying to understand what it looks like to actually shift incentives that not only drive consumers but also drive producers, as you highlighted, Eileen, the fact that the crops that are most heavily subsidised are really simply refined carbohydrates, and that if we want to think about a nourishing food system, we have to rethink fundamentally how we provide incentives to producers and address not just, the carbohydrate-based staples, but also think about how we reinvest in traditional foods, how we reinvest in fruit and vegetables, the list goes on. The other thing that I wanted to highlight as well is, I think, along the lines of this career journey idea, is that as I've sought to engage with policy, I did start my career very much thinking that I would do that in a government space, but realised quite quickly that for me, I'm just a very bad bureaucrat. But it's something that I have really sought to kind of straddle, and I suspect many people are also, in sort of a practical sense, navigating this. If we want to effect change, we need to step outside the sectoral lines. And I moved from government into academia with a view to doing research that would enable people working in government to engage for nutrition outside of the health sector and think about those drivers of food systems and how, if you sit in the health department and you're responsible for nutrition, you can then actually engage with those who are shaping those regional incentives. How do you talk to somebody whose job is governing agricultural subsidies? How do you talk to the international trade people who are simply focused on World Trade Organization commitments? How do you talk to the people who sit in finance and are setting your tax schedule without any knowledge of the fact that your tax schedule is going to have direct impacts on the relative affordability of food? So as part of that, I sought very actively to step back into government regularly throughout my career. The other thing that has led me even more into the development space is the fact that a lot of the policy innovation to address food systems has been occurring in the majority of the world. It hasn't been occurring in high-income countries where many of these really powerful interests hold a lot of sway over policy making. It's actually been countries in the Pacific region, in Africa, across Asia, who are thinking really intentionally and strategically about how to address their growing burden of non-communicable diseases, the really acute food insecurity that they're facing at the moment. And that's been really exciting also in terms of how we think about leadership and how we think about sometimes that very, I guess, historic one-way flow of knowledge from high-income countries to low-income countries. I think this isn't unique to food systems. A colleague was telling me how during COVID he was working in sort of health policy proper, and there was this real kind of block because all of the innovative approaches to addressing the spread of COVID amongst populations were kind of happening outside of the high-income world. And yet there was, in the health policy, there's this really strong, we learned from Europe and America, and then we translate that into these, low resource contexts. And there weren't the same mechanisms to go, actually, let's have a look at South Korea and how they're addressing this and bring that back, or let's look at Indonesia and what they're doing. And so I think it's very similar in terms of, I guess, what I would love to see in the future of leadership in food systems and nutrition, that we're actually looking really at examples like the ones that you described and thinking about, well, how do we reverse innovate into high-income contexts? Because there's a lot of really exciting innovation happening around operationalizing new approaches to food systems, and taking those, I guess, historical blinders off can be really helpful. The second thing I wanted to talk about was building community, and that's because I think we would all agree that change is much more possible if we work together. I've learned a lot about collective action through being part of this global network of Women in the Next Generation Leadership Collective. And I think maybe particularly in academia, there are very strong pressures against working collectively and against building communities of practice and, networks like this, only because the metrics are so focused on individual performance and on fostering competition, as with this sort of sense that actually we, produce more innovation and better outcomes if we're in competition with each other. And I'm sure that, anyway, I won't go into the complex sort of neoliberal and cultural dynamics of that, but I think one of the opportunities that we have, maybe particularly as women, but again, I am very well aware of non-women who are people who don't identify as women who are leading in this space. But I do think that as women, we have an opportunity to step in and create spaces where we can foster collective action, where we can look at what it means for us to bring together diverse disciplines, diverse expertise to tackle this problem. Because I think it was incredibly clear from both Michelle's introduction and Eileen's explanation of the complexity of the food system problem, that somebody with one disciplinary expertise can make a really important contribution. But to fix this system level problem, we need to be teaming up and working together, to be recognising that there are learnings to be had, not just in a technical sense across, agriculture, trade, nutrition, etc., but also learnings to be had in a global sense. My impression is honestly that we're facing incredibly similar challenges. There was, I think, 2016, I did field work with colleagues in Fiji, in India, and in South Africa. And spending time in each of these countries, working with really passionate, talented people, it was almost frightening how often we were hearing the same things in terms of exactly the challenges that you mentioned. Real, significant underinvestment in agriculture, other than maybe 2 or 3 staple crops. Really, a total lack of investment in infrastructure that was devoted to local markets. Huge rising burden of non-communicable diseases that were associated with poor diets, at the same time as rising food insecurity and really pervasive challenges in terms of people's access to nourishing food. And that left me obviously not only a little bit depressed, but also with this real sense of the power of working together and pooling solutions that actually we don't see any one country absolutely nailing food policy and lining up their incentives, but we do see countries all over the world with things where they're nailing something, right? Where we've seen some really exciting action. I'm working with a colleague at the moment who's leading the evaluation of Brazil's public procurement program for foods, which is linking small farmers, local small farmers directly with schools in terms, and also now has requirements on healthy public procurement for schools. It's an incredibly innovative program, and her evaluation will generate really exciting new data. And that, I think, is something where there are multiple countries who are really interested in seeing how this pans out. And I think you could say the same thing at pretty much every country. So that's what gives me hope in terms of the opportunities, but also then the value of these communities where we're able to come together and share that knowledge. The final thing I wanted to speak to was this value that I think we all hold around justice and working for, it may seem naive, like working together for a better world. But what I see in my work on food is that food is both incredibly intimate, but also provides this window, this lens onto society and culture and economy. So it was so clear listening to you how food touches on all of these dimensions of human experience. And so I think that when we do step up as leaders in a food space, we can also push to shift unjust economic systems. We can push to shift and to reclaim, in some cases, culture. We can push to change the way that communities are oriented. And I think it's a really exciting space to be working in terms of that potential to not just, narrowly and technically think about food, but also embrace those wider implications. One thing that I have been learning about a lot in the last 10 years in particular, so I finished my PhD in 2011 and have had the privilege of working with colleagues in most regions of the world over the past 15 years. And I've been really consistently challenged around what it looks like to take a decolonizing approach to practice and to really interrogate my own practice. I've had some really incredible mentors, not least Professor Karen Hoffman in South Africa, in terms of understanding what it looks like to learn, to be humble in my own practice, and to think about my research is taking place in a context where I'm looking at trying to overcompensate for 200 years of extractive and badly done research in many contexts that I work in. And I am learning all the time. I don't think that I'm nailing this at all, but I think from a justice lens, there is these big dynamics around food and justice, but there's also the personal practice dynamics of how we work in this space, which is conflicted. And I think that challenging our own maybe unconscious assumptions about who holds knowledge and what that knowledge looks like and how it should be portrayed and understood is really pivotal in terms of changing the way that leadership broadly in food systems is done. And I'm really encouraged by, for example, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization setting up a new mechanism for Indigenous people to speak directly into global food policy. So there's lots of exciting stuff happening, but I do think it's something that we all have a responsibility to also foster and really encourage. So I'll leave it there. I think.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Now we'll go to questions from the floor shortly. So I hope you've all been thinking of all the things that have struck you as we've heard our two speakers. But while you think of those things, because I've got one I'm going to ask a question to both of you, I think. I think you have your own question. I think you can share that out. You're both at stages of leadership in your careers. And I look around the room and I see people at various stages of leadership in theirs. And I'm wondering what advice you'd like to pass on from your own experience about women particularly moving into leadership. You talked a lot about leadership.
It feels like a very personal question. I would say to trust your gut. I think that we as women underestimate our own innate wisdom, and not that only women have wisdom, but we underestimate ours. There's so many statistics. It's easy to find that, going into a job interview, men are so much more confident on average than women that they can do a great job, even if they meet only 60% of the criteria for the job. And women who meet 110% will go, oh, I don't know if I can. So that would be my encouragement, is to really trust your gut and nobody knows everything. But I think for me, it's also helped to be able to think about that idea of contribution and to go, this is what I can do. And so, yeah, trust your expertise and wisdom.
Maybe I can sort of build on that and perhaps say that, yeah, I think particularly when you're coming from a point of difference. So, for example, you're the one woman in the room and you do things differently, you have a different way of thinking, or I don't know, you're coming from somewhere else. Yeah, I mean, often you're not going to feel so confident about speaking up, or necessarily confident that the way you think is right or legitimate, but there is a time and place and space for all of that. And often it's not that, because you're different, it's worse, it's just different, and it's not better or worse. And there's a positive contribution to be had often in having that diversity. I think people are starting to realize a little bit more that that you find strength and maybe better sustainability in diversity and having more and different ideas in the room. I was debating with one of my colleagues recently, and we're coming from very different perspectives, and we just couldn't agree and come to the same sort of answer. Couldn't agree and couldn't come to the same answer with things, and I thought, well, at least this is good, because when you do finally agree, we'll know that we're both right. and it's like converging points where, you know, we'll intersect somewhere and it's got to be a strong point there. So.
All right, I think the questions are a little bit of running around with some. I'm not sure we're trusting the other microphone.
I think it should be right. It needs to be
Okay.
right against that.
All right. Right, you two keep that one. Stick your hand up. All right, and I'll bring them on to you. Thank you both so much for your time. It's been really insightful, so thank you. Something that did come to mind when I was spoken a lot about food security, and I think Anne-Marie mentioned about sometimes access to nutritional food. I was interested to hear about some challenges which you may have come across in terms of tackling some of the attitudinal and beliefs towards or interest around perhaps some of the actually accessing nutritional food. I know that a lot of the introduction of perhaps fast food chains into some developing countries has seen pretty devastating health implications. I'm interested to hear about your experience with that as well.
I would say I guess what can be called the nutrition transition has had a huge impact on the way that people eat and the food cultures as well. I think one of the challenges globally has been cultural shifts and aspirational shifts in terms of what a good diet looks like. One of the other aspects of this that I think maybe is less well known is also a historical legacy in terms of early nutritionists going into cultures where there was no nutrient composition analysis. And this happened even in the Pacific, where there was this, well, you know, we don't really know what the nutritional composition of wild is, so why don't we just have imported fruit because we know that enough is good for you. And relatedly, you have nutrient composition analyses done in the 1990s, which then showed that most tropical fruits in particular have such a better, nutrient composition that's so incredibly richer than something like an apple. But because it was unknown food, there was a lot of skepticism and just concern, which, you know, it's a complicated question, but I think that's also left a legacy where in many cultures, traditional food is so seen as, you know, this is what poor people eat, and there's so much complex culture around the food we consume, but I mean, really unbridled marketing of really unhealthy food, especially to children, I think is only fostering that and potentially also driving it to a large extent. I think, you know, we know that food habits are set by the time you're about 5, so that early life nutrition is impactful, but also misunderstanding. I did some work on what's called the double burden of malnutrition with colleagues in India about 10 years ago, and it was really hard to hear some of the stories. I had nutritionists saying that they were working in low-income communities, and women would say to them, look, we see the sweet biscuits advertised in that way. We can see from the adverts and that they have whole grains, they have milk. So we know these are really good foods, and we feed them to our babies as wean foods, right? Which is pretty much the worst thing you can feed them. But it was done out of the sense that, oh, well, I can tell it's really great for my kid. And to me, that is a huge culprit. I think marketing unhealthy foods to children is irresponsible. So
Yeah, I think I've got my own. I think you mentioned something earlier on that some countries have less sway over big corporations in the food industry than in other places. There's less regulation, and sometimes this has to do with trade as well, where there's not the regulation of what comes in or what is sold or how it's marketed, as well as nor being balanced by the right sort of education to know that, you know, sugar should be taken in moderation, or that, and often then coupled with that, I remember going to places where you walk through the local supermarket and Pepsi and soft drinks was so much cheaper than water they were so much easier to carry home in convenient 6-litre packages than a 4-litre bottle of water that with a hand cut your hand. And with all of these sorts of things sort of playing into each other, it's just really fighting against the odds. Yeah.
Yes, okay, I'll just start from the front.
I think this concept of fighting against the odds and collaboration as well is one that I really like to extrapolate a little bit more on, especially talking about collaboration in the academic sphere and this culture of hyper-competitiveness and individualism. I'll try not to anthropomorphize it too much, but it also happens in the sphere of botany and plants. You see monocultures. And to me, it feels very emotionally similar because you see all of these plants that exist so much better in collaboration with one another. In North America, we know it as something called the Three Sisters Garden, where you plant corn, bean, and squash together. We're a lot more successful together than they are alone. So I'm curious what both of you have to say about fighting the odds, about going against these very institutionalized norms and cultures, and what you've seen as being successful for integrating collaboration amongst humans, amongst plants, amongst agriculture.
Ooh. I mean, definitely, we're stronger together. It's, you know, you can sort of take that as superficially or as deep as you want, but, you know, we don't live in a vacuum. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we are dependent on others around us for, you know, everything that we do and who we are, even, you know, without anybody around us, we're not anybody. I do think maybe on a bigger scale of things, when we're looking at the global thing, the gender thing is a big part of that. And perhaps sort of stereotyping a little bit, but to a degree, women have different ways of communicating and relating to each other. And you look at, for example, women, peace and security discussions, they recognize that, you know, women aren't going to pick up arms to start with. You would rather, you know, talk and look for other solutions. Like, we tend to talk through our problems and things before we decide to bash each other up or something, as an example. There are different ways of doing things, and I think the collaboration and working together is very much key to be able to live in harmony. It sort of, you know, doesn't really work any other way. We can live very individually, but we're never going to be as strong as the sum of the parts, and more that we can get otherwise.
I agree, and I love your analogy of the Three Sisters Garden, and the term that comes to mind is reciprocity. I think that's a real pathway into collective action in terms of thinking, being okay with only being part of the story and being able to own the part of the story that we are, but so to see what other people bring to that symbiosis. I think that's really important as a practical step, to be able to play to other people's strengths and to encourage them to find their voice and recognize that that's complementing your own voice rather than competing with it. I think in part it is truly like a mindset, which, and that often my experience is that you can subvert the matrix, that, you know, your powers that be, whichever space you work in, are asking for, because you do produce more and you produce better when people are able to play with their strengths.
Can I add a little bit? In the last year or two, they started talking about Indigenous foreign policy, and I remember seeing a lecture not that long ago I think it was from one of the schools from within the ANU, and there was a presentation where they were talking about the notion of relational autonomy, that we are ourselves, but and we have, to a degree, it was very much in the face of going against the idea of what neoliberalism tends to say that we are and do in terms of human nature, that we still have, to a degree, our own autonomy and decisions to make, but we have to do it in relation to others. It's still, you know, we're limited by the relationships we have in terms of how much autonomy we have.
Our time is well right now, so I thought a few more minutes, a few more questions, and then I might invite everyone to stay and ask the speakers the questions themselves.
No, thank you so much for that. I have a question related with how do you deal with leadership in developing countries where it's like a lot of like cultural background. Like I had experience to do a project in Tanzania, so I was working there for like 3 months with the women, and it was very hard to educate and to tell them, like, because they sometimes see you as a foreigner, so to speak, and they are like, okay, who you are to tell me what I need to do or how to change my culture, including with the land, because we work really focused with Maasai communities, and obviously, as people know, like, they don't really have products in the land, so it is really hard. And when you mentioned that you were doing a program in Rwanda, so how to basically deal with that cultural shock, to try to change or try to educate when you are foreigners for them, when you are completely stranded for them.
I'll just briefly comment because I know my context is different, but one thing that I have leaned into is partnering very closely with people who are in the context, which I know tends to be development practice as well. But I mean, having that, and again, I think with that idea of reciprocity, but also being able to, I guess, respect and support people who are familiar their own context and the context which they're working in. And I know that you don't always have the opportunity, but I think that has been something where I have also learned immensely through the partnership.
Yes, long-term partnerships and building up trust and understanding and good communication is, I think they recognise is one of the things that leads to very successful work and effectiveness in terms of being able to work. I like to call it international cooperation, like sort of thinking about working in partnership. It's not always exactly partnership, but I think that I don't know if it's any sort of similarity. So I'm working with partners in Uganda now, and I'd never wanted to work with the African region. I had already spent a bit of time working in Latin America and Southeast Asia. I thought, you know, I'm still learning about all the different cultures and differences in those parts of the world. I know nothing about Africa. When I started in this job at QSA, I thought, how am I ever going to understand, you know, the context and where they're coming from and who they are and what they mean when they say this, when they do that. And I'm still learning about it. And, you know, however, it's like when you go, you know, if you were born in Sydney and you go to Melbourne, it's hard that you will ever get to know it like the back of your hand in the same way that you know where you grew up. You know, that this area is that, and this is where you go to find this. It's the same sort of thing that I feel like I never going to quite get a full grasp of what the culture is like and what the people and, you know, all these nuances, whether with the language or the way things work. And I think there's just that sort of acknowledgement and respect of that and trying to bridge that gap So recognizing that, I guess, I think what makes it complex too is that in growing up in such different contexts, then trying to understand each other and maintaining the respective difference, I think is something that, yeah, I guess you build up together with trust and partnerships as you go. And yes, that takes time. I think as an example with QSA, it's, I think, been one of the successes that we've had with some particularly long-term partnerships, to be able to, you know, have good conversations, and there's an element of trust that's necessary in there. Yeah.
We might, the time has amazingly marched on while we were discussing absolutely everything. It turns out food gives you the opportunity to discuss absolutely everything. I would like us to wind up there, simply so those who need to go can go. Please join me in thanking our speakers. We'd like to show our appreciation to you for this evening with a gift of now famous Women in Development Coffee Month. You will have the best looking coffee in the office, and we hope that we'll see you, your colleagues, and others that you bring along here in the future again. I'd also like to thank the rest of the Women in Asian Development Leadership Group who supported the smooth running of our event this evening. Chris, who's somehow kept the tech under control. Our volunteers, thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you. Please connect with us online, either on our website, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. You will be the first to know of future events if you join our mailing list. And if you choose, you can become a member, which will help us financially, as well as giving you the opportunity to participate in our mentoring program. Our next event will be in July, which is scheduling at the moment. You will know all about it if you join the mailing list. I will invite you just to now stay if you're able, enjoy more food and drinks, have a chat to people, enjoy the space. But before we do go, I know Chris has a few very quick things that you would like to say.
Thank you. No, I've got a loud voice.
Sorry, online, you're not going to get any of this, but it's mostly housekeeping.
That's okay.
And thank you for forbearing with technology.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about the sound. I obviously didn't take the instructions in properly, and every venue has its sound and video peculiarities, is all I can say. So I just want to say thank you, Michelle. As always, a great facilitator. Thank you again, great speakers, great volunteers. We really appreciate you because we're a volunteer-run organisation. We'd love your input. You in fact can't leave until you've done a post-it note on our sheets. We want to know what topics do you want to hear next. That's critical for July. And what's your key takeaway from tonight? And on that one, we want you to put your name on the back of it, please. We'd also, I'd also say last night was quite interesting. I was in Brisbane for our event there. Completely different focus, and that's the thing I love about Women in Development. Whatever the topic is, every speaker brings their own flavour and their own experience and their insights. Last night we had two academics who are also practical people talking about complex food systems and touching on the areas you were both talking about tonight. In conflict areas, in climate impacted areas, gender issues, Indigenous Australian programs to promote foods here. So if you're interested in that, we did a recording, probably not as beautiful as this one, but feel free, it'll be up on the website next week and our YouTube channel. So again, thank you. Please come again, please bring your friends. You'll find a little card there. If you take a card, your friend can come for for half price. And if you've got other colleagues you want to tell, there's a postcard, take that one and give it to them. It's got a one of those QR codes. You can just go straight to the website. So thanks a lot. And again, thanks, Michelle. Food, drink, thank you. Thank you.
And we've evolved this line, watch inside. And have one. Staying inside, so we made it. Design. And that's that. Yeah, that one. I don't have anything. Sorry, I don't think I've ever had anything. Thank you guys. It's so great to have someone talking about small farming ventures and someone talking about food policy.
Really good.
I don't know how long that's so cool.
I have no idea how long.
That's fine. Especially, you can't be going like, what the hell's the time? So you're like, I don't know. We'll just talk until we finish.
For that. Oh, okay. You guys comfortable with that? I'll just like. Yeah, sounds good.
Oh, I know. No, in front of the battery.
No.
Oh, that's that.
Yes. Okay. I do like that.
And that biscuit here, if you want to take an Anzac biscuit. Good night. Bye.